Why American bombers feared Britain's tiny Mosquito plane. Gunjuo. August 1943, RAF Marham Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell stood on the tarmac at RAF Marham, watching a de Havilland Mosquito taxi past his parked B-17 Flying Fortress. The contrast was jarring. His bomber was a massive four-engine Fortress bristling with machine guns, armoured crew positions and self-sealing fuel tanks. The British aircraft was sleek, small, made entirely of wood and carried no defensive armament whatsoever. Mitchell had arrived in England 3 months earlier with the 8th Air Force, part of the American strategic bombing campaign against Germany. His squadron flew daylight precision raids deep into occupied Europe, facing intense fighter opposition and flak that turned the sky black. Each mission was calculated gamble. Would they reach the target, drop their bombs, and make it home before German fighters overwhelmed them? The losses were staggering. On the recent Schweinfurt raid, 60 of 230 bombers had been lost, 26% casualties in a single mission. Mitchell had watched bombers explode around him, seen parachutes blossom as crews abandoned stricken aircraft, counted the empty hardstands when his squadron returned to base. And here was this wooden British plane, unarmed, built by a furniture company that supposedly flew bombing missions over Germany with minimal losses. An RAF pilot emerged from the Mosquito, removing his flight helmet. Mitchell approached him, curiosity overcoming protocol. "Excuse me, Flight Lieutenant. I'm Colonel Mitchell, 8th Air Force. Can I ask you about your aircraft?" The British pilot was young, perhaps 25, with the casual confidence that came from surviving numerous combat missions. "Flight Lieutenant David Reynolds, 105 Squadron. What would you like to know, Colonel?" "I've heard stories about the Mosquito. They say you fly to Berlin and back without fighter escort, without defensive guns, and your losses are negligible. That can't be accurate." Reynolds smiled slightly. "Depends on your definition of negligible. We've lost aircraft, certainly, but our loss rate is roughly 2% per sortie. I understand your heavy bombers are experiencing somewhat higher casualties." Mitchell bristled at the understatement. "We're losing 20% submissions, but we're carrying 10 tons of bombs with 10-man crews in armoured aircraft with fighter escorts. You're carrying what, 2 tons? 2 crew? No armour, no guns, no escort? 4,000 pounds of bombs typically, yes. 2 crew, pilot and navigator, no defensive armament, no armor plating, just speed and altitude. The Mosquito cruises at 380 miles per hour at 28,000 feet. German fighters struggle to catch us, and when they do, we can outrun them. We don't need guns if we're faster than the enemy." Mitchell looked at the Mosquito with renewed interest. The aircraft was beautiful in its simplicity, a streamlined fuselage, twin engines, clear canopy. But it looked fragile compared to his B-17. "It's made of wood. How does it survive combat damage?" "Wood has advantages," Reynolds explained. "It doesn't show up well on radar. It's easy to repair. We've patched battle damage with standard carpentry techniques. And it's light, which contributes to our speed. The entire aircraft weighs less than your bomber's bomb load. But you can only carry 2 tons of bombs. We carry 5 times that." "True, but we reach the target, Colonel. Our navigation is more precise because we're not fighting through fighter attacks. We bomb from higher altitude with better accuracy, and we always come home, or nearly always. Your 10-ton bomb load doesn't help if the aircraft doesn't survive to drop it." The implication was clear and stung. American bombers were flying heavily armed, heavily armoured missions and dying in droves. The British were flying unarmed wooden planes and coming home consistently. Something was wrong with the American approach, and everyone knew it. The origin. The Mosquito was born from a heretical idea that bombers didn't need defensive armament if they were fast enough to outrun fighters. In 1938, when the Air Ministry was demanding heavily armed, heavily armoured bombers, Geoffrey de Havilland proposed exactly the opposite. De De Havilland's company was known for civilian aircraft and wooden construction techniques. His proposal was radical: build a bomber entirely from wood, strip out all guns and armor, use the weight savings for more engines and fuel, and rely entirely on speed for survival. The Air Ministry rejected it immediately. Every aviation expert knew that bombers needed defensive guns. The entire doctrine of strategic bombing assumed formations of heavily armed aircraft providing mutual protection. An unarmed bomber was suicide. But de Havilland persisted. He ran the calculations repeatedly. A wooden airframe would be lighter than metal construction. Eliminating guns, armor and gunners would save more weight. Twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines would provide enormous power. The resulting aircraft would be faster than any fighter in service and able to operate at altitudes where most fighters struggled. The Air Ministry remained skeptical but authorized a small order in 1940, primarily to use non-strategic materials. Britain was desperately short of aluminum. A wooden aircraft would use furniture industry capacity that wasn't contributing to war production. The first prototype flew in November 1940. Test pilots were astonished. The aircraft handled beautifully, faster than contemporary fighters, with range exceeding most bombers. During trials, a Mosquito easily outran a Spitfire, Britain's fastest fighter, in level flight. Production began in 1941, but skepticism persisted. Many bomber commanders refused to operate unarmed aircraft, viewing the Mosquito as a dangerous experiment that would result in easy kills for German fighters. The first operational squadrons faced hostility from peers who flew real bombers, heavy aircraft with proper defensive armament. The Mosquito crews would prove them all wrong. The 1st Mission's 105 Squadron received the first operational Mosquitoes in November 1941. The squadron's role was reconnaissance and precision bombing, targets where accuracy mattered more than tonnage. The crews were volunteers, experienced pilots willing to fly experimental aircraft that conventional wisdom said couldn't survive. Flight Lieutenant David Reynolds was among the first. He'd flown Blenheim bombers earlier in the war, experiencing their vulnerability firsthand. The Blenheim was moderately fast but inadequately armed, suffering terrible losses to German fighters. When Reynolds heard about the Mosquito program, he volunteered immediately. The Blenheim tried to be fast and defended, he later explained. It failed at both. The Mosquito made clear choice. Be fast enough that defense is unnecessary. That logic appealed to me. The first operational mission was a photographic reconnaissance sortie over northern France in September 1941. Reynolds flew it with navigator Philip Sampson. They crossed the channel at low altitude, climbed to 30,000 feet over France, photographed their targets, and returned without encountering enemy aircraft. It was almost disappointing, Reynolds recalled. We'd prepared for dramatic confrontation with German fighters, practiced evasion maneuvers, worked out emergency procedures. Instead, we flew to France, took photographs, and came home. The Germans never got close enough to engage. The first bombing missions followed in May 1942. The targets were precision objectives, specific buildings, rail junctions, bridges, where accuracy mattered more than destructive power. The Mosquitoes would fly individually or in pairs, navigate directly to targets, bomb from high altitude, and depart before German defenses could respond effectively. The tactics were completely different from heavy bomber operations. American and heavy British bombers flew in massive formations for mutual protection, approached targets in daylight, and fought through fighter opposition. Mosquitoes flew alone, relied on surprise and speed, and were usually gone before the Germans realized they'd arrived. The loss rates reflected this difference. In the first 6 months of Mosquito operations, 105 Squadron flew 144 sorties and lost 2 aircraft, a 1.4% loss rate. Comparable figures for heavy bombers were typically 5 to 10% per mission, sometimes much higher on particularly dangerous raids. The Berlin Raids. The mission that established the Mosquito's reputation occurred on January 30th, 1943. The date was significant, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. The Nazi leadership had scheduled massive celebration in Berlin, with Goering delivering a radio address to the German people. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, decided to disrupt the celebration. He couldn't send heavy bombers to Berlin in daylight. The losses would be catastrophic, but he could send Mosquitoes. 3 Mosquitoes from 105 Squadron were assigned the mission. The plan was audacious: fly to Berlin in daylight, bomb the city during Goering's speech, and return before dark. The timing would be visible humiliation for the Nazi leadership, demonstrating that British aircraft could reach Berlin whenever they chose. Reynolds was selected to lead the mission. He and navigator Sampson studied the route carefully. 600 miles each way over occupied Europe, much of it heavily defended territory. They'd fly at maximum altitude to avoid flak, rely on speed to evade fighters, and navigate precisely to reach Berlin at the exact moment of Goering's broadcast. The mission departed RAF Marham at 11 to 15 hours. The 3 Mosquitoes climbed to 28,000 feet and headed east. German radar detected them crossing the Dutch coast, but the aircraft were too high and too fast for the flak batteries that opened fire. Fighter controllers scrambled Messerschmitt 109s to intercept, but the German fighters couldn't climb fast enough to reach the Mosquito's altitude before the British aircraft were passed. Reynolds's navigation was precise. They reached Berlin at 1600 hours, exactly as Goering was beginning his speech to the assembled Nazi leadership. The Mosquitoes bombed the city centre from 28,000 feet, targeting the area around the radio station broadcasting the speech. The bombs didn't hit the radio station. Precision from that altitude was impossible, but they hit close enough. The explosions were audible in the radio broadcast. Goering stopped speaking mid-sentence. Air raid sirens wailed in the background. The celebration was ruined, the broadcast cut short, the invincibility of German air defences exposed as fiction. The 3 Mosquitoes turned west and headed home. German fighters pursued but couldn't catch them. Flak batteries fired as the aircraft crossed back over the coast, but the Mosquitoes were already descending, using speed and altitude changes to evade the tracking guns. All 3 aircraft returned to RAF Marham without damage. The mission had taken 6 hours, covered 1,200 miles, bombed Berlin during a major Nazi celebration, and cost nothing except fuel and bombs. The propaganda impact was enormous. German civilians who'd been assured that British aircraft couldn't reach Berlin in daylight had heard bombs exploding during their leader's speech. The Nazi leadership was humiliated, and RAF Bomber Command demonstrated that the Mosquito could strike anywhere in Germany whenever conditions were favourable. More importantly, the mission proved that speed and altitude were viable alternatives to heavy armament. The Americans took notice. The American skepticism. Despite the Mosquito's success, American bomber commanders remained committed to their doctrine. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were magnificent aircraft, 4-engine bombers capable of carrying 5 tons of bombs with 13 50 caliber machine guns for defense. American doctrine held that these bombers, flying in tight formations, providing mutual defensive fire, could penetrate German airspace without fighter escort and survive to bomb their targets. The reality was far bloodier. German fighters had learned to attack heavy bombers from head-on, where defensive fire was weakest. They'd concentrated their attacks, overwhelming individual bombers with multiple fighters simultaneously. The casualties mounted relentlessly. After the disastrous Schweinfurt raid in August 1943, where 60 bombers were lost in a single mission, American commanders faced uncomfortable questions. Should they suspend daylight bombing until long-range fighter escorts were available? Should they adopt different tactics? Should they consider different aircraft? some American officers looked at the Mosquito with new interest. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was among them. After his conversation with Reynolds at RAF Marham, he requested permission to fly in a Mosquito to understand its capabilities firsthand. Reynolds arranged it. Mitchell flew as observer on a training flight, experiencing the aircraft's performance personally. The speed was remarkable. Cruising faster than his B-17, could fly at maximum power. The altitude was impressive, climbing to 30,000 feet with ease, while his bomber struggled to reach 25,000. The handling was responsive, the visibility excellent, the entire experience fundamentally different from flying heavy bombers. "It's like comparing a race car to a truck," Mitchell said after landing. "The B-17 is powerful, rugged, capable of absorbing tremendous damage, but it's slow, cumbersome, vulnerable. This aircraft is fast, agile, capable of avoiding damage entirely. I understand why your losses are so low." But Mitchell also understood why the Mosquito wasn't suitable for American strategic bombing doctrine. "You're carrying 2 tons of bombs. We need to deliver 10 tons per aircraft to make our raids economically viable. Even if we had Mosquitoes, we'd need 5 times as many aircraft to deliver equivalent tonnage. The logistics are impossible." Reynolds nodded. "Different doctrines, different aircraft. We're not trying to flatten industrial areas. We're targeting precision objectives, where a few well-placed bombs are more valuable than hundreds of tons scattered across wide areas. For that mission, the Mosquito is ideal. For yours," he gestured at the B-17 parked nearby, "you need your fortresses." But the conversation planted seeds of doubt. Was the American approach optimal? Were there missions where speed and precision were more valuable than tonnage and defensive firepower? Could some objectives be achieved more efficiently with different aircraft? The Amiens prison raid, February 18, 1944, demonstrated the Mosquito's capabilities in a mission impossible for any other aircraft. The target was Amiens prison in northern France, where the Gestapo was holding 120 French resistance members scheduled for execution. British intelligence received desperate request: destroy the prison walls to allow the prisoners to escape. The mission required extraordinary precision. The prison was in a populated area. The walls needed to be breached without killing the prisoners inside. Conventional heavy bomber raid would flatten the entire facility and surrounding neighborhood. Unacceptable collateral damage. What was needed was surgical strike, placing bombs exactly on the prison walls. Mosquitoes of 140 wing were assigned the mission. 19 aircraft would participate, flying at extremely low altitude, 100 feet or less, to achieve the precision necessary. The crews studied reconnaissance photographs, memorized the prison layout, and planned their approach routes to minimize exposure to German defenses. The formation departed RAF Hunsdon at 1100 hours. They flew to France at wave-top height, below German radar coverage, navigating by visual landmarks. The approach to Amiens was timed to arrive at lunch hour, when prison guards would be in the canteen. The first wave of 3 Mosquitoes attacked at 1203 hours, releasing bombs with such precision that they struck the base of the outer wall exactly as planned. The explosions blew holes through the wall large enough for men to escape through. The second wave attacked the guard quarters, destroying them and preventing organized response. The third wave targeted the inner prison buildings, creating additional confusion. The raid lasted 4 minutes. The Mosquitoes escaped at low altitude before German fighters could respond. 2 aircraft were lost, one to ground fire, one that flew too low and struck a prison building's chimney, but 17 returned safely. The results exceeded expectations. The walls were breached, 258 prisoners escaped through the holes, and 182 evaded recapture. Among the escapees were many of the resistance members scheduled for execution. The precision of the attack meant minimal casualties to prisoners. Only 50 died during the raid, most from bombs that struck prison buildings. The mission demonstrated capabilities no other aircraft possessed. Heavy bombers couldn't achieve the required precision. Fighter bombers lacked the range and bomb load. Only the Mosquito combined speed, range, precision, and sufficient payload to execute the mission successfully. American bomber commanders studied the raid carefully. Their B-17s and B-24s were powerful weapons for strategic bombing, but they couldn't execute precision strikes like Amiens. The Mosquito filled a niche in the air war that heavy bombers couldn't address. The pathfinder role. By mid-1944, Mosquitoes had found another role where their capabilities were invaluable, pathfinding for heavy bomber raids. The aircraft's speed and altitude allowed it to reach targets ahead of main bomber streams, mark them with flares or target indicators, and guide the following heavy bombers to accurate bombing points. The Pathfinder squadrons were elite units, flying the most dangerous missions with highest accuracy requirements. They'd approach targets first, identify precise aiming points despite darkness or weather, mark them clearly, and often remained in the area during the main raid to assess results and direct following waves. Squadron leader Robert Braithwaite flew Pathfinder Mosquitoes from early 1944 until war's end. His role was guiding American heavy bomber raids to German targets, marking aiming points that the B-17s and B-24s would bomb in daylight. We'd arrive 20 minutes before the American formations, Braithwaite explained. We'd identify the target, specific factory buildings, rail yards, whatever the objective was, and mark it with colored smoke or target indicators. The American bombardiers would aim at our markers, achieving accuracy that would be impossible if they were navigating independently. The cooperation between Mosquitoes and American heavy bombers was symbiotic. The Mosquitoes provided precision targeting that the Americans needed. The American bombers provided destructive power that the Mosquitoes couldn't match. Together, they achieved results neither could accomplish alone. Mitchell flew several missions where Mosquito Pathfinders marked his targets. He watched the fast British aircraft arrive ahead of his formation, precisely mark the aiming point, and depart before the heavy bombers arrived. The accuracy of the resulting raids was dramatically better than missions without Pathfinder support. I stopped thinking of the Mosquito as alternative to our bombers, Mitchell later wrote. It was complementary system, different capabilities for different missions. We needed both. The heavy bombers for tonnage and destructive power, the Mosquitoes for speed, precision, and specialized missions. Together, we could accomplish objectives that neither could achieve independently. The speed problem. Despite growing appreciation for the Mosquito's capabilities, American bomber crews remained wary of the aircraft. The reason was simple and primal. The Mosquito was faster than American fighters. When Mosquitoes and American bombers operated in the same airspace, the British aircraft would occasionally be mistaken for enemy planes by American gunners. The Mosquito's silhouette was unfamiliar, its speed suggested hostile intent, and nervous gunners sometimes fired before identifying targets properly. Several incidents occurred where American bombers opened fire on Mosquitoes. In March 1944, a Mosquito flying Pathfinder mission ahead of American bomber stream was engaged by nervous B-17 gunners who saw fast twin-engine aircraft approaching and assumed it was German. The Mosquito evaded without damage, but the incident highlighted the danger. Flight Lieutenant Reynolds experienced this personally while marking targets for American raid in April 1944. His Mosquito was fired upon by a B-24 formation. We were at 28,000 feet, clearly marked with British roundels, flying straight and level to mark the target. Suddenly, tracers flashed past our wing. A B-24 gunner had decided we looked suspicious and opened fire. Reynolds took evasive action, rolling the Mosquito into diving turn that no German aircraft could match, and radioed sharply to the American formation. "Bloody hell, we're on your side. Stop shooting at the pathfinders." The firing stopped, but the incident illustrated the problem. The Mosquito's speed and appearance made it seem threatening even to friendly forces. American crews, who'd been trained to shoot at anything fast and twin-engined, sometimes reacted before thinking. Coordination procedures were established. Mosquitoes would announce their presence to American formations, describe their positions, and remain clear of bomber streams except when actively marking targets. American gunners received additional training on Mosquito recognition, but the underlying issue remained. The British aircraft was so much faster than American bombers that it triggered defensive instincts even among allies. It was ironic, Mitchell reflected. We feared German fighters for good reason. They were killing us daily, but we also feared the Mosquito, not because it was dangerous, but because it was so different from our doctrine that we didn't know how to work with it. That fear was our failure, not the aircraft's. The final year. By 1945, the Mosquito had become indispensable to Allied air operations. The aircraft flew more mission types than any other warplane: high-altitude bombing, low-level precision strikes, pathfinding, night fighting, photographic reconnaissance, submarine hunting, even civilian transport. Its versatility stemmed from the basic design: fast, long-ranged, capable of carrying various equipment depending on role. The loss rates remained remarkably low. Throughout the war, Mosquito operational losses averaged 2 to 3% per sortie, dramatically lower than heavy bombers. Some specialized units flying particularly dangerous missions experienced higher losses, but even these rarely exceeded 5%. By comparison, American heavy bombers averaged 5 to 7% losses per mission during 1943 to 1944, with some raids experiencing losses above 20%. The cumulative effect was stark. A Mosquito crew could expect to survive a full operational tour, while heavy bomber crews faced grim odds of completing 25 missions. The survival rate created confidence that reinforced performance. Mosquito crews knew they'd probably survive their missions, which encouraged aggressive tactics and repeated volunteering. Heavy bomber crews knew their chances were poor, which created understandable caution and resistance to extending tours. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell completed his combat tour in early 1945, having survived 35 missions over Germany. Of the 10 aircraft in his original squadron, 7 had been shot down. 63 men who'd arrived with him were dead or prisoners. He attended a party at RAF Marham celebrating 105 squadrons' completion of 500 operational sorties. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost cheerful, so different from American heavy bomber squadrons, where every mission was survived rather than celebrated. Reynolds was still flying, now a squadron leader with 2 tours completed and beginning his 3rd. Mitchell asked him how he maintained his nerve after so many missions. "It's not nerve, Colonel, it's mathematics. Each mission has perhaps 2% chance of loss. After 200 sorties, I've beaten the odds, but the odds themselves are manageable. Your bombers face 5 to 10% loss rates. After 10 missions, you've lost half your original squadron. That's not survivable mathematics, that's attrition warfare." Mitchell couldn't argue. The numbers were clear. "I envy you that wooden plane. It's kept you alive when metal and guns couldn't save us." Reynolds nodded. "Different doctrines, different aircraft, different results. We chose speed over protection. You chose protection over speed. History will judge which was correct." Post-war recognition. The Mosquito's wartime record was extraordinary by any measure. Nearly 8,000 aircraft were built. They flew over 200,000 operational sorties. Loss rates were among the lowest of any combat aircraft. The versatility allowed the Mosquito to serve in virtually every role except heavy strategic bombing. Yet the aircraft received less recognition than other warplanes. The Spitfire became Britain's most famous fighter. The Lancaster bomber was celebrated for the Dam Busters raid. American bombers were immortalized in films and memorials. The Mosquito remained relatively obscure, despite its superior performance and lower casualties. Part of this stemmed from the aircraft's nature. The Mosquito didn't fight dramatic battles. It didn't destroy dams or bomb Berlin in 1,000 aircraft raids. It simply flew its missions efficiently, completed its objectives, and returned home. Efficiency doesn't create legends the way dramatic sacrifice does. American bomber crews who'd watched Mosquitoes operate with envy recognized the aircraft's superiority for certain missions. Mitchell wrote in his post-war memoir, "We flew our heavy bombers with courage born of necessity. We accepted terrible losses because we believed in strategic bombing's importance. But I always envied the Mosquito crews their aircraft. Fast enough to avoid most danger, versatile enough to execute any mission, survivable enough that most crews completed their tours alive." Geoffrey de Havilland, the aircraft's designer, received a knighthood after the war, but he remained modest about his creation. "We designed an efficient aircraft using available materials and sound aerodynamics. The Mosquito's success came from refusing to accept conventional wisdom about bomber design. Sometimes the best protection is not to be hit at all." The lessons. The Mosquito taught lessons that military planners struggled to accept. Speed and altitude could provide better protection than armor and guns. Smaller, more efficient aircraft could achieve strategic results comparable to larger bombers. Versatility was more valuable than specialization. Simple materials like wood could produce superior performance to advanced metals. American air doctrine eventually incorporated some of these lessons. Post-war bombers emphasized speed increasingly over defensive armament. The B-52, designed in the late 1940s, carried minimal defensive guns compared to wartime bombers, relying primarily on altitude, speed, and electronic countermeasures for survival. But the fundamental lesson remained difficult. Sometimes the unconventional approach succeeds where conventional wisdom fails. The Mosquito worked because it violated every assumption about bomber design. It succeeded because it rejected the protection that everyone insisted was necessary. The American bombers that feared the Mosquito feared its speed, its difference, its challenge to their doctrine represented resistance to that lesson. Accepting that an unarmed wooden plane could outperform armored metal fortresses required admitting that the entire heavy bomber program might have been flawed approach. That admission came slowly, grudgingly, after thousands of bomber crewmen had died flying aircraft that prioritized protection over speed. The mathematics were clear. The Mosquito's crews survived while heavy bomber crews died. But doctrinal inertia and institutional pride prevented rapid adaptation. Epilogue: The Last Mosquito. The final operational Mosquito was retired from RAF service in 1963, nearly 20 years after the war ended. The aircraft had continued flying reconnaissance missions, target towing duties, and specialized roles where its unique combination of speed and range remained valuable. Today, fewer than 30 Mosquitoes survive worldwide, most in museums. The wooden construction that made the aircraft so practical during wartime proved its vulnerability in peacetime. Wood rots, fabric deteriorates, maintenance becomes impossible. Most of the 8,000 Mosquitoes built have vanished completely. But aviation enthusiasts remember. They remember the wooden wonder that proved speed could replace armor. They remember the aircraft that flew to Berlin and back when heavy bombers were being slaughtered over France. They remember the bomber that crews could expect to survive in when survival seemed impossible. Flight Lieutenant David Reynolds flew his final Mosquito mission in June 1945. A reconnaissance sortie over Germany documenting war damage. He'd completed 3 operational tours, flown 187 combat missions, and survived the war without serious injury. His survival odds in a heavy bomber would have been approximately 0. In post-war interview, Reynolds was asked whether he'd have volunteered for mosquitoes if he'd known the risks beforehand. His answer was immediate. The question is backwards. If I'd known the survival rates, I'd have volunteered even more eagerly. The Mosquito kept me alive through 3 years of combat. That wooden plane was the safest aircraft in the war for one simple reason. It was too fast to catch. American bomber crews eventually stopped fearing the Mosquito and started envying it. They recognized what the small wooden plane represented, an approach to aerial warfare that prioritized survival through performance rather than accepting losses through inadequate speed. The Mosquito didn't revolutionize strategic bombing. Heavy bombers remained necessary for destroying industrial targets. But it demonstrated that speed, altitude, and precision could achieve results that tonnage and defensive armament couldn't match. That lesson, learned painfully over years of brutal combat, remains relevant to military aviation today. The tiny wooden plane that American bombers feared became the aircraft they wished they had flown.